Welcome back for those of you who were here with us last night, and for everybody else. I'm Kathy Leff, and on behalf of the Wolfsonian, Florida International University, our partners, WLRN and the Miami Herald, I want to welcome you back to Power of Design Complaints, our inaugural Ideas Festival. Last night we kicked off our program with a speed, rapid fire of how the idea of complaints is embedded in the objects in our collection, and I want to thank again our ringmaster, master of ceremonies, Kurt Anderson, for providing a context for the conversations of the weekend and for doing it so masterfully, starting with the Declaration of Independence and bringing it up to today. I'm just going to start very briefly with some words about our collection, the genesis of this event, and then I'll just run through the structure of the day and just a little bit of an outline of our format. The Wolfsonian has a very deep and vast collection deriving from the late 19th to mid-20th century, the height of industrialization through World War II. We're interested in the ideas, ideologies, and agendas embedded in objects and how these objects tell the stories of the social, political, and technological changes that transformed our world. We try to encourage people to see things in new ways, to learn from the past, to give meaning to the present, and to shape the future. As you know, the theme of our festival is complaints, but taking complaints as a starting point, that any innovation, well, not any innovation, but most innovations begin with some point of dissatisfaction. Most solutions or problems are solved with dissatisfaction with the previous state. So we're really challenging everybody through these sessions that we have today to think about the resources and some of the innovators and thinkers that we have among us and how they have used a current state to arrive at a new solution. Our collection deals with the rise of all the masses, mass communications, mass transportation, mass industrialization, mass political movements, mass urbanization. So we thought we'd draw from those themes of our historical collection to look at where innovation is occurring today. And we'll specifically deal with innovation from gripes around cities and city life, politics, and travel, at least during the day, and tonight we'll deal with technology and specifically the internet. None of this would have been possible without our generous sponsors, and we are so appreciative of the lead sponsorship we received from the Knight Foundation. And not only did we get sponsorship from the Knight Foundation, but we're so thrilled that Carol Coletta, Vice President of National Initiatives, and Matt Hagman here, the Program Officer at Miami, were major contributors to helping shape the program, as well as Carol participating in it. So thank you so much, and we're really grateful to them, to its president, Alberto Ibargüen, and Vice President Dennis Scholl. I also want to thank Northern Trust Bank, the Fontainebleau Hotel, which was the most complained about hotel in its time, for being our host sponsor. And I hear there was a little noise last night, so if anybody had any complaints about that, it was all part of the theme.
Spring breakers.
I want to also thank Intelligence Squared, and you'll meet Hannah and Sarah later on this evening, who are presenters and producers of this wonderful program, Prophets of the Internet. And so it was so much fun having met them last year in London, seeing the format and the brilliance with which they really engage people in debate and conversation and discourse. And I want to thank an unnamed mutual fan who was so excited about our collaboration that he agreed to underwrite the program tonight and ensure that it was free to all who wanted to attend. Unfortunately, we had to keep some people out. The demand's been so high, but again, we expected some complaints. To quickly run through the day, I just want to let you know what we're offering. You may have seen some of the complaints activities. All this stuff is outlined in your program. So if you feel like taking a break, if you need to get out of here, we have healthy food, junk food. We didn't want any complaints about that. Please take advantage of WLRN's complaint booth, and we thank Kenny Malone for setting that up, and we hope you'll gripe to your heart's content and tell him and whatever is on your mind, and if you have a solution, we'd like to hear that as well. And if you are more articulate in verbal format, there's the complaints box, and we hope you'll leave your suggestions and complaints there. I want to thank Sean Donaldson for organizing the Beauty Confessional. So if you have any self-loathing issues, please see him, and he'll give you some suggestions and an RX for whatever you feel needs improvement. And we also have, for those of you who are stressed, there's massage therapists, there's yoga on the 5th floor, and so we hope you'll take advantage of that. So this session will go from 10 to 11:30. At 11:30, we'll have a PowerPoint by Jaime Lerner on some of the work he's done in Brazil. While some of you might want to take a little break or take a break and come back in. 11:45, humorist Andy Borowitz will take the stage with Kurt Anderson. Then after at 12:45 to, actually 1:15 to 2:30, we have box lunches which will be on the ramp. You'll be able to take a beach chair, hopefully it won't be raining, and just occupy the sidewalk. We did this in honor of Gabe Klein and how he's animated the streets, and not only just the streets, but the public spaces between them, and the complaints activities, and will continue throughout the day. We also invite you that in between to take advantage of the building is open. We hope you'll visit our permanent collection galleries, see the Rebirth of Rome, which is on the 6th and 7th floor, the exhibition Bummer, curated by Todd Oldham, and Complaints in Inalienable Right, curated by Steve Heller, is in the lobby. Just a note, if you can turn off your cell phones and put them to vibrate. If you need the restrooms, they're to the right of the elevators as you go out the rear door. And there's also restrooms in the cafe. And now it is my great pleasure to reintroduce Kurt Anderson, and I'll just give a little bit of a bio for those of you who weren't here last night. Kurt's a novelist, a cultural historian, a big thinker, a public radio host of Studio 360. He's authored many books and writes extensively and speaks extensively and articulately about culture. Some of his novels include True Believers, Heyday, Turn of the Century, and in fact, we've set up a whole, while there is a reading list of the literature complaint on the website, there is also books by all of our participants for sale in the lobby, in the cafe, in the bookstore. So I'm sure if you grab any one of them, they might be even willing to sign it. He regularly contributes to publications such as Vanity Fair, writes for television, film, and the stage. And he wrote about design as a New Yorker columnist and was the design and architecture critic for Time magazine. He was co-founder and editor of Spy, editor-in-chief of New York, and creative director of Colors. And he is quite an accomplished and an amazing person who has, with such ease and fluidity, was able to take the threads of the then and bring it up to today and make this all make sense. So I really want to thank you, Kurt, for all you've done and welcome you back today.
Thank you, Kathy. It is my pleasure to be back. And speaking of giving just a little bit of history before we get going with the day's events, it wasn't so long ago that, which is to say some hundreds of years, that the city-state was the jurisdiction, the entity that mattered in the world. Modernity began, and of course, modernity was and is an urban phenomenon overwhelmingly, but the city as a key thing began to seem overwhelmed by the nation. Well, it seems like in this century, the city is reemerging as the entity that counts, where the problems are often and usually most acute, and where the solutions these days to those problems are being found and managed. The city, this is I would say in a certain way, at least this part of the 21st century is all about the reemergence of the city as the place we should focus on, and that's why we're beginning today's sessions about the city. To lead our incredibly distinguished, not just distinguished panel, but a panel of people that I'm really excited to hear and talk to because they are practical people who are involved in trying to make cities better. They're not just, in any sense, ivory tower thinkers. To lead our discussion is, as Kathy mentioned, Carol Coletta, who is Vice President for Community and National Initiatives at the Knight Foundation, but before that has had an incredible career as an expert in the urban experience and in shaping cities. She was the director of Art Place, which is a collaboration to accelerate placemaking creatively. She was the president and CEO of CEOs for Cities and the executive director of the Mayor's Institute on City Design. I now hand over the stage to Carol Coletta.
Thank you, Kurt. As Kurt said, we do have an amazing panel, and to be able to have this conversation here in Miami at this moment in time, I think is an extraordinary opportunity for all of us in the room to listen in, and I hope this will be fast and furious. We are starting in great Miami style a little late on Saturday morning. I know you've read their bios, but just let me make sure you know who each panelist is. Gabe Klein most recently served as Commissioner of Transportation for the City of Chicago, has recently been appointed a fellow. What did they make you at ULI, at Urban Land Institute? Yeah. He's going to hang out there for a little while he is writing a book on his experience in getting done. Which I want to talk to him about. So while he awaits the birth of his first child, very soon. Jaime Lerner is someone I've had the opportunity to know and be with on several occasions. He's the former and famous mayor of Curitiba, Brazil, and the former governor of the state. He is the author of the book, Urban Acupuncture, which we have never, those of us who do not read Spanish, which probably means me in this room, have never been able to read the book because it was not published in English until the Knight Foundation decided to make that possible, and we're so excited about the book coming out later this year. Andrés Duany is an architect and founding principal of DPZ here in Miami. I know you all know Andrés. He's widely recognized as a leader of New Urbanism, that international movement that has really had such influence around the world and how we think about communities and think about cities, and is now working on sparking a new movement that I'm going to get him to tell you about. And Alejandro Aravena is also an architect, leads Elemental, which he calls a do tank, started at Harvard, but now situated in Chile, which has fabulous and sort of breathtaking ambition and around the quality of life for poor people. So which is something that I think all cities struggle with everywhere, so I can't wait to hear more. So Gabe, I'm going to start with you, since traffic is probably the most frequent complaint in this city and maybe every other city. Are there reasonable contemporary solutions?
Yes. And when people complain about traffic, it can mean different things. You know, there are people with children that feel like their children can't run in the street or play in the street like they did when they were kids. There's other people that complain about traffic because it's congestion and it takes them a long time to get across the bridge to get to their job. So there's different reasons that people complain, but these are very reasonable complaints. And the fact is, there is a recipe for success. We talk about, well, it can take time. There's a cultural shift that needs to happen, but we talk about the 4 E's: engineering, education, enforcement, encouragement. We don't have enough time to go deeply into all of those things, but some of our cities are newer, like Miami and LA. Some are older, like DC and New York, and there's different strengths you can play to. But basically, in some cases, you have to re-engineer your streets for people because they've been focused sort of de facto on automobiles for a very long time, but really just our lifetime. And the old cities have an advantage when you try to take them back to being people streets with the automobile as a component. So you have to re-engineer. You have to educate people about the history of our streets and what can be done. You have to do things. So you have to do pilots, take over a street, use it for different things, show them, tactical urbanism like we're going to do on the sidewalk for lunch. And you have to enforce, because people are like big kids. We're all big kids. And in DC, we've cut traffic fatalities by 83% over the last decade. And automated speed enforcement and red light enforcement, all of those things have been very crucial. So there is this recipe. I think also in cities where you start to see more people walking, biking, and taking transit, the cars start to moderate their behavior a bit. And in DC, when I moved there in the mid-90s, cars were doing regularly 40 to 50 miles an hour, and now pretty much everybody does 25. People just don't go over 25. There's too much other stuff going on in the street. So when the cars own the street, they misbehave. When there's a balance of the modes, they tend to behave better. And so I think our job is to mainstream these, what we call alternative transportation. If you mainstream that, then the character of the street can change.
Mainstream alternative transportation. I like that.
Yes.
I like that. Jaime, you served as both mayor and governor. You must have heard more than your share of complaints. And I know that you...
I don't remember.
You try to forget. And I know you looked at your city and the possible solutions so differently. It seems to me that you turned so many things on their head. I'm curious, from all of the things that you've been noted for and written about, what are the things that stand out most for you as the important achievements that you made in your city?
I think the most important is having a vision of the city. For me, the city is a structure of living, working, and moving together. I brought my brown bag, and my metaphor about the city is the turtle. Because the turtle is living, working, and moving together. At the same time, the turtle, the shell of the turtle looks like an urban tessiture. So we can then imagine what could happen if we'll cut the shell of the turtle. Living here, working there, leisure here, she's gonna die. That is happening in many cities in the world. When we separate people by living here and working there, separating urban functions, separating people by income, ghettos for very rich people, ghettos for very poor people, separating people by age, religions, everything, income. So this is one important issue. The other is the importance that we're giving too much to the cars. Cars are not important. I'm sorry to tell you. For me, the car is the cigarette of the future. So I'm not saying you won't have cars. You have cars, your cars for different ways, for leisure, for travel, but in the daily life in a city, you have to work in different ways, through different modes. That means if you have a subway, it has to be a smart subway. If you have a bus, you have to have a smart bus, a smart taxi, a smart bike, like they did in France and all over the world. They transformed the bike in a public transport. And probably there will be a place in the future for a new car besides the existing car for trips, but for the city, which is the smallest car in the world. Not this size. It's the half of the size of the smart car in the length. So, and I can fit inside. So, this is individual public transport. I'm not saying this, any car. It's not enough being electric. What's important is working domestically. That means many car industries, they're having very performatic cars, beautiful cars, small ones, fantastic. At the Champs-Élysées, you can look many cars. But what they're doing, they're putting their cars, this kind of car, where it can have 100 kilometers per hour, they are putting in the freeways. And the big car inside the city. This is not logical. We have to have a car inside the city with 25 kilometers per hour maximum, autonomy of 100 kilometers, and a car that wouldn't hurt you or your neighbor. So I designed, my staff, we're working in the 6th prototype. It's totally recycled. It's a paper, by paper, honeycomb, resin, very strong, but it's recyclable. So, and it's electric, but it has to feed. You don't own the car. The car is this way. You can move, and you pay by the consume of energy. So I'm saying that. I'm saying another issue. There are three main, most important issues that we're dealing in the cities. Besides the normal priorities, education, healthcare, the care of children, but 3 main issues which are important, not only for your city, but for the whole mankind. One is mobility, of course. The second is sustainability, which is linked to mobility. And the third is coexistence, social diversity, which it will become very important because the city is becoming the last refuge of solidarity. So, I'm saying that, speaking about complaints, I have the feeling that there's a lack of vision of the city. Sometimes dealing with public transport corridors, it's just enough, it's not enough corridors. Sustainability, new materials, green buildings, new sources of energy, this is not enough. We cannot be so naive on having here a green building and here a green building, and from this green building to the other, we're traveling through a city which is not green. So I think we have to change, and I realize one thing, change is possible. I've met many people in São Paulo. They're very happy when they're saying, oh, São Paulo has no solution. They can have orgasms if you're saying there is no solution. But if you try to say, oh, it is possible, they're looking to you, probably you're a liar, or so. So it's possible, and that makes me sometimes anxious. Because in many cities, it takes hundreds of years to make an important change. Every time a new plan, every time a new diagnostic, and in between the city, the quality of the city is dropping, is dying. So we have to work and I'll finish it. We have to work very fast. Fast is important. That's why I'm working now with urban acupuncture. Because the planning takes time, and it has to take time, the whole process of planning. But sometimes, through a local intervention, you can provide a new energy that could help the whole process of planning. It's not instead of the planning process, it's to help. And sometimes it's one, or two. I'll give you an example. In Paris, the pyramid is a wonderful example of a great, great acupuncture. With one gest, it solved a problem of centuries. So I'm sure we can find here and there, here in this city, many great examples. What is the most important? Doing fast. Because we don't have the whole life to do it. I'm sorry, I took too much time.
No, and you raise themes that I think are running across the panel. Andreas, I mean, you're working on several of these themes, right? How do we work faster in cities to make change? How do we work with, you know, Jaime calls it urban acupuncture, and you're working on something called lean urbanism. So, and also I think the one other theme here that I'd love for you to pick up on is this notion of social diversity and how you actually make that possible in city. How are you designed to make that possible in cities? So pick up on some of those themes.
Well, you introduced me as an architect, which I do practice still, and particularly used to practice. But I've become increasingly fascinated by urbanism. And at first I thought, well, it just affects so many more people. Isn't that what's interesting? You know, it's so much more powerful in its effect. But actually, there's something different about it, which is architecture actually is completed in a relatively short campaign. You know, it might take 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. But urbanism has an additional factor, which is almost unique to it at its field, which is time. And so the present, you know, if you look at the present, it's a distortion field, because that's all you see. But as an urbanist, you can say, well, 25 years is nothing. Therefore, we can conceive of something that seems impossible and then bring it to the present. It's the vision Jaime talks about. Vision is actually just looking into the future, you know, not being confused by the present and then bringing it forward. And that aspect of time is absolutely fascinating because nothing else that I do is, has time available. And then there's another aspect which I've realized. Architecture, particularly the XL projects that are now being built in China, and the whole theory of architecture as urbanism. Architecture can indeed these days be very, very large and very, very complex. But it doesn't have time on its side, and it also doesn't have the intervention, the contribution of many, many individuals and organizations sequentially. So what makes urbanism interesting is not only time, but sequence and the intervention of many. So then I said, well, you know, how do we enable this resiliency, which is so extraordinary in cities, to happen? Why don't we just do bottom-up planning? You know, just ask everybody, see what they say, and then it ends up taking, you know, 20 years to get anything done. You know, the subway in 2nd Avenue that you mentioned, everybody's been consulted, including all the moles, you know, and everybody who owns a pipe, and of course you can't get it done. It took 50 years, right, before it started. So there's the bottom up, and now there's a backlash of top down, which is, whoa, what about Robert Moses? Look what he got done, and so fast. So let's just empower somebody a la Robert Moses with their own budget. Bloomberg approached it. Sometimes in Latin America it's possible to do it. You know, by the way, the great revival of Barcelona that everybody admires was top down. Okay, and highly organized, but top down, and with very good bones. But let's say, what do we do in the United States? And what I've found here, the most interesting sort of theory that we're working with is called subsidiarity, which is you don't decide, you decide who decides. And that involves that some decisions are made by the mayor, absolutely, and some decisions are made by the United Nations. And it's not our job, you know, that deals with, you know, climate change is at a very high level. Some decisions are made by the person, some by the household, some by the street, some by the block, etc. And as long as you ask the right increment, as long as you're consulting with the correct increment of decision maker, things get very efficient. You know, well, let's discuss the interior of your room. Well, okay, that's you and I. Let's discuss parking. You're never going to solve parking at the level of the city, but you can very easily solve it at the level of the block. I've always found that to be the case. We have an intractable problem. Nothing, well, so you talk to the shops here, and they say, well, these shops need 15-minute parking, and these shops need 2-hour parking, and you solve it relatively easily. And of course, there are mayors who have an enormously important role to play, and they should be allowed to play it and not be continually running for office. And so what we're working on now is this protocol that allows people to act appropriately. That is going to require the removal of the categorical rethinking of bureaucracy. Because bureaucracy has become, particularly in the United States, where it's all lawyered up and the liability and particularly the presumed fairness of process, a bureaucracy has become the great impediment of everything. And by the way, there's public sector bureaucracy, and private sector bureaucracy, and there's also something new, which is the consultancy, which gets you through both bureaucracies, and they themselves adore bureaucracy. You know, the more bureaucracy they have, the more important they are. And so Carol gave us a grant, a very substantial grant to study this.
Not Carol.
The Knight Foundation. I sort of,
I wish Carol could get
yeah.
grants, but I've been
well,
reminded.
you're personalizing, like,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
he does Brazil, I do New Urbanism. Anyway, what happens is that we're now studying the successes. And wherever I turn, there's a success. For example, this gentleman here, of course, I knew about. I'm about to learn about your success, you know, in Chile. Yesterday, I learned about the rebuilding. My fellow diner at last night's dinner was a fellow who was involved in the rebuilding of San Francisco after the earthquake. And I had to be reminded that that was an enormous disaster, and that it actually got very, very quickly patched up to a much better outcome. To the extent that most of us don't remember, what happened? An earthquake in San Francisco, was that large? We're all Katrina, 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 Katrina. And he said, well, what happened is that government became dysfunctional and 6 people who were representative took over and just did it. And I said, that's interesting. So there's the mode of disaster which requires a certain level of subsidiarity. And that's what we're studying, particularly because bureaucracy, as it is currently constituted, is disempowering 4 kinds of people that are very important. First of all, we know here in Miami it disempowers the immigrants. Immigrants know how to do things, and here they have to do it basically without permits because they can't deal with the bureaucracy. So they're building and correcting and doing what they can without bypassing things in a kind of gray permit market. The second thing that's happening is that anybody who has a small business cannot afford, a small developer cannot afford the weight of regulation. So if you're small, it's very difficult to have the consultants. The third people who are missing are the hand workers. I found that people who make things by hand can't stand basically paper. And I just want to make a bicycle. I want to make that car. I want to make Jaime's car. You turn me on. I want to set up in Hialeah right now with a bunch of, you know, exiled Venezuelan engineers and make the car. Will you try to do that? To make something by hand, by the way, including a chocolate chip cookie that you want to sell. Okay, because you can't make anything and sell it. And then the third crowd that's really allergic to bureaucracy are, in fact, the millennials. Our generation grew up with bureaucracy. We know how to navigate it. We, in some ways, make a living off it. We're complicit in its growth. It grew, in the last 35 years, bureaucracy grew, and we became navigators through bureaucracy. The people who are starting now, when they confront the codes and the overlaid handicapped and all the legalisms and the huge contracts, in my office, the young people look at this stuff and just go, I'm not gonna look at that. You know? We do look at that because I started when the Miami Code was this thick. And then when it grew, I grew with it. I was the frog that didn't jump out of the pot. But the young people are coming in and say, you want me to get into that pot? I'll never catch up. And they don't. And so and of course, that's the generation that's coming up that has the energy, that is getting things done in Detroit, because what's happened is the glacier of bureaucracy in Detroit has receded. They can't afford it. They can't afford it, so the kids are coming in and doing and selling things. And that's what we're studying. And I go to Detroit not to help, but to learn. And that should be very clear. There are lots of people that are doing, doesn't need anything. Just, in fact, if anything, when I do speak in Detroit, it's just leave the kids alone. Just leave them alone. You know, because now that they have money, they're crawling back in. They're embarrassed that they don't have. Oh, we can't regulate. No, don't regulate. Go back to 1974. It'll be fine.
Alejandro, it's interesting to hear Andreas talk about the intervention of the many as part of urbanism, as a fundamental part of urbanism. And it struck me when I was reading about your work that that's part of what you're banking on to get done what needs to get done. This notion of moving faster is also clearly a part of your ambition. Your firm Elemental is, or DoTank, maybe not firm DoTank, I'll let you define it, is working on a scale and speed strategy to share what you're learning with poor communities around the world, because you've made a calculation, this is interesting, that the world needs to build a 1 million inhabitant city per week for the next 20 years with $10,000 per family. Now, again, that's sort of blows your mind. What do the strategy and standards look like for that?
I think it's important to understand, starting to understand that the reason why we need to accommodate such an amount of people in such a speed, 1 million people city per week with $10,000, is that people come to cities because they have something to gain. I mean, people do not go into a trouble just because they're stupid. There's the prospect or the expectation of opportunities that cities concentrate. Jobs, education, health, recreation is what explains why people come to cities. The problem is that the way they're coming, it's provoking more trouble than benefits. But still, the expectation of an opportunity to improve quality of life is there. Numbers actually show that, no matter how counterintuitive this may sound. Every single indicator is better on cities and on countryside, and the aid of the state or even of a company, it's more efficient when people is concentrated in space. So it makes sense, in principle is good news. The scarcest resource to deal with that equation is not money, it's coordination. So if there's any power, going back to the title about complaints and the power of design, I would say if there's any power in design, that's the power of synthesis. What will be really needed, or what design can offer to such a tough equation to be solved, is synthesis. In a complex problem like the city, where it has economical, political, social, cultural, environmental aspects, what is needed, you call it vision, it's synthesis. And design, what can do is that it can, on the table, put a point. Okay, what are we going to do here? Well, I would do this, and you draw something, or design, or model something. Oh, that's what you meant. Okay, I may agree or not agree, you may complain or not complain. The problem with complaints is that they tend to be very dispersed. I mean, you are uncomfortable, you don't know exactly what. So what is needed again, what design can offer, is the synthesis, so that you can channel that rage, resentment. When you meet with communities, that the level of complaint is expressed as if it was a social time bomb. But instead of trying to dismantle the bomb, I would say that design should try to channel that energy, because it's extremely powerful, and we will need that. Going back to your question, how do we deal with such numbers? Well, what the profession, what the state can do is to put a frame so that we do what individual performance can achieve spontaneously, and then allow for individual performance to complete that. We won't solve that equation if we don't use the slum and the favela capacity. It's not an incapacity, it's the capacity to do and provide themselves with shelter despite not having any aid from outside. So I would say that instead of bottom up or top down, the question is open or close. If you create an open system, and it has to be a system that is not negotiated, I may, as an architect, know things that people do not know. I have the privilege to study, so I don't have any guilt in saying, well, this is going to be done this way because I know things that you don't. But people may know things that I don't know, but in order for that to take place, you have to have an open system more than a closed system. So what we're trying to do, going back to what you mentioned, is that we're treating the city as architecture in the sense that it has form. I do know very specific, some things that do not have to have a plan or do not know how to look like. No, it is very specific. It's going to look like this. It will have a point, people may recognize it. Okay, I get it. But then we're treating architecture as a city. I mean, it's going to be completed and it will leave room for uncertainty.
I'm interested in the point each one of you made around speed. And the speed to get things done, the speed at which we need to get things done, and the need to overcome bureaucracy, the need for urban acupuncture, the need for speed in terms of acknowledging and embracing the opportunity that pulls people to cities, and yet the problems caused once they get there, if a city is overwhelmed. I want to talk about speed. How do you move with speed? Gabe, you said you're writing a book about this. How do you move with speed in the face of today's city, in the face of today's rules and regulations?
Yeah.
You were
It's
able
such
to
a-
do that in Chicago.
And in DC.
And in
but
DC.
It's such a big topic. It's fascinating, and everything that these guys are saying, it's just getting my brain moving because it's bringing back memories. And the millennials don't have the patience for bureaucracy. And my two bosses, Rahm Emanuel and Adrian Fenty, in the public sector, most of my career was in the private sector, by the way, in startups, where if you didn't get shit done, you were out of business by the end of the quarter. And so that was my attitude coming into government. And luckily I worked for two guys with serious attention deficit disorder, which I think I also have, which I think actually is helpful. I mean, I've never been diagnosed, I'm scared to go get diagnosed. But the ability to take on 10 projects at once and to manage all of that is really key. And in terms of the top-down versus bottom-up, I agree with Alejandro, this open system is important. And I think to do it well, you have to be one of the people. I didn't want to be one of these DOT commissioners that rode around in the back of a black SUV with a driver all the time, although I did once in a while. But I would be out there riding my bike, taking transit, talking to people. And I think when you build credibility with people, they allow you to work faster because you're one of them. You actually understand what they want versus some guy sitting on high. And then I think the other thing that we did in DC and Chicago and was done in New York and in South America is the power of the pilot project. So you go out, like when Rahm took office in Chicago, we went out and put in a protected bike lane, a separated bike facility in the first 30 days that he was there. Because we wanted to show how fast we could do it, how easy it was, and how much change we could create with basically $115,000. But also, we took office in May. You have limited time in the summer. The mayor committed to 100 miles of bike lanes. And if we didn't get one out there, there was no frickin' way we were going to do 100 miles in his first term. But because we did that out there, we started a conversation, we started a controversy, some people loved it, but that is the catalyst that allowed us, and we're on track, we'll be at 70 miles this year. And by the way, I don't need to be there. Like, the people like us sometimes need to come in and start the change. Like, having the great boss is important, right? But being able to go in and know that you're not planning on being there for the rest of your life as a bureaucrat gives you the freedom, and we were talking about this over breakfast, to go in and make that sort of significant directional change and then get the hell out with, intact. But that change, if you get those things in the ground, and what we were talking about at breakfast is, like with the streetcar in DC, it was important to get that first line in the ground, which started under Dan Tangerlini. He just laid the tracks down in a project without really telling anybody. Then he gave it to me. And I was like, thanks, Dan. And then we actually started to build out that system, but we had to put together a vision plan. So people saw how that one little line fit into an overall vision for the city. And you have to think in political terms. So in terms of getting shit done, you have to realize you're there for 2 years or 4 years. Maybe your mayor will get elected, maybe he won't, re-elected. And so you gotta break it down, like being a good manager and setting the vision, but then breaking it down into tangible milestones and hitting those with the realization that you may only have 24 months. And people in government, they don't operate that way. Their intuition says, I'm gonna say no, because if I say yes, it means I have to actually do something. And that's a problem, because then I might put myself out there, and then if I'm not successful, which I probably won't be, then I'll lose my job. But if you go in saying, like, my goal is to lose my job, and I want to make as much change as possible until I lose my job, and if I do well, I'll probably leave on my own terms, I think your definition of success can be very different. And I think that's what the younger generation is demanding from us. And I think whoever made the point, I think it was you, Andres, about getting the hell out of the way, like with ride sharing in Chicago, the mayor and I and Rosemary Crimble, who runs taxis, we made a conscious decision just not to really get involved. Like, let's see where this thing takes us. Even though we're holding $18 billion worth of taxi medallions that will eventually be worthless. But if you want to make change, that's the kind of thing that you have to do. And you have to be a little bit fearless, and you got to take chances.
And we are going to go on, but shift the subject slightly.